us. As always, I want to start with a prayer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'hikianu azman hazeh. Praise be you, Adonai, our God, sovereign universe, who protected us and brought us forth to this day. It's a pleasure to have yet another deeply engaging adult ed program. I want to thank Mark, of course, for doing it. We have one person who is new, two people who are new that I think most of you have not met in a while at least. That young lady, stand up, Lynn. This is Lynn Schoaf. So if you've been here for 30 years or so, you know Lynn. Her son Scott, who's now 45, had his bar mitzvah here. And Lynn's a neighbor of ours and a lovely, lovely woman. And then this fella here in the white hat, this is Stephen Drexler. I've told several of you about the guy I went to elementary school with who moved here. That's Stephen.
That's me, okay.
So who's your first grade teacher?
First grade.
Was it Ms. Leiter?
Mrs. Reardon.
Okay, so we were in the same class, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth grade.
Short 60.
Of all things.
61.
Stephen and his wife Karen decided they wanted to move from Arizona to the Carolinas.
All right, well, welcome. And on a Sunday morning that's nice and rainy, I'm going to operate from here because I've got some reference books behind me. This will be basically, you know two things. Starting off with this premise. Number one is that we don't practice Judaism. Judaism is not today what it was to ancient Hebrews, Israelites, Jews, and so on. We need to pause for a second because we need to make another introduction. Chat with y'all a little bit afterwards too, just to kind of schmooze a little bit. All right, so let's start off once again with the premise. So you know that we do not practice Judaism in the way that the ancients did, whether they were just a little band of people around Jacob and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the Hebrews as they were in Egypt and as they came out, or the Israelites around the time of King David. You just kind of know it's not the same all the way up until a little point in time. There was an inflection point in time, and that's what we're going to cover today, and what happened and how we got to be who we are today and how we practice Judaism and why we practice Judaism in a way today. Now, I'm very nervous because Charlie Brown is here. And so I know he won't throw slings and arrows, but he might look at me disapprovingly at some point along the way. Always. All right. So, and it informs actually kind of who we are and actually our relationship with our Christian friends. And there are non-Jews in the room, so it's a respectful conversation, but it's the historicity, the history of how we got to where we are. Now, what I've had to do is I've kind of had to fast forward through a couple thousand years of Jewish history to kind of get to this point. So back from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs and matriarchs, all the way through the slavery in Egypt and the Exodus, and then coming into Judea and the rise of eventually King David and the... Okay, that's all right. Okay, it's okay. It's okay. And the rise of King David and King Solomon and the Israelite kingdom at the time, the eventual assimilation of the northern tribes out of existence, and then left with Judea as kind of almost like a rump state, but then the Babylonian conquest of that area, the exile into Babylonia, 70 years later coming back to the land of Israel. Only a few people though, not many, most stayed in Babylonia. And that was King Cyrus that defeated the Babylonians. And then we exist as a people among other conquerors during that time. So we had a sovereign Jewish nation for a while under King David, King Solomon. It went out of existence with the destruction of the first temple in 586. And then eventually we come back, and then we exist there, but most Jews and most scholarship is existing in Babylonia, modern day Iraq. So that continues on until kind of roughly peaceably until the Maccabees or the Hanukkah story, and the Assyrians came in and tried to take us away again, and not just take us away physically, but to obliterate us, not through anything other than forced assimilation by not allowing Jews to do what they do. But it was also a Jewish civil war because there were Jews that were going along with them in Jerusalem. And so the countryside Jews kind of revolted. We rededicated the temple. That's the Hanukkah story. And we had another sovereign nation. We had another sovereign nation for about 70 years. And the Maccabees, the family was actually named the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans began to take on the attributes of Greek society, what they had just defeated. They wore Greek clothes, Greek names, and they started a conquest of the area. And eventually that fell apart after about 70 years, and Rome began to take over this area. Yes, ma'am.
What happened that the Maccabees
Because-
defeated them and then they started to assimilate? What was going on there?
So I'm getting the high sign, the stink eye from my wife about miking up. Hang on. Yeah. Okay, better? Is that good? All right, so I don't have to raise my voice quite so much. So the Maccabees, there were five brothers, their father, Mattathias, and the five brothers. All of them died in the war, except for one. He was named Simon, and he had this kingdom. And for a bit, he was okay. The book of Maccabees, which exists in the first and second Maccabees, exist in the Catholic scripture, but not in ours. And it depicts this as a time of eternal peace and wisdom and justice and everything. We have to take that with a little grain of salt because the book of Maccabees was written by whom? No, the Maccabees. No, they sponsored scribes basically to tell the story, and so obviously they're depicted very favorably. However, what Simon did is the first thing he did is actually material to this, is he took away the priestly line. Normally priests were coming up as descendant from David's priest. His name was Zadok. And then the kings were from David. Well, now they combined the priesthood and the kingship into one. Simon did that. So that was one thing that he did. And then when he died and his sons started to try to run the place, they got into arguments and they kind of divided the kingdom into north and south again. Remember, there was Egypt to the south, there was Rome to the north, and it was a mess. And they took on attributes of Greekism, that Hellenized themselves. They weren't so concerned with having a Jewish just state of justice. They were concerned with conquest. And so eventually they were at each other so much that Rome just kind of did a little bit like this, just kind of stepped in, right? So that was about the year 60 BCE or something like that, not long before Caesar.
Thanks.
So the Jewish state went out of existence, and it was a Roman protectorate. It wasn't really a province yet, it was just a protectorate. And they appointed a guy named Herod, and King Herod was Jewish. So his people were Idumean, so they were down in Saudi Arabia, and he married a Hasmonean woman, so that gave him legitimacy. And he was really, really, really brutal, but he kept little the place, and that was good. So the Romans didn't have to really worry about it. And he built. So he built, guess what? Little cities called, Caesarea, right? Named it after his Roman patrons. Tiberius, named after his Roman patrons. He built Masada, he built a bunch of palaces for himself and getaway places. He built Sepphoris. He built gigantic palace in Jericho, that's actually where he died. And so he had all these places to go and hide, and he taxed and taxed and taxed. And of course, he built the second temple at the site. So he basically expanded the Temple Mount, built the structure you kind of see today with the walls around there that was up on that plateau. And yet, when he put the temple up there, this grandiose building, guess what he put at the top of that? A Roman eagle. So to the Jews of the time, they knew exactly whose bread the side was buttered on. Do you know what I mean? So he was Jewish, and he was really rather despised among his Jewish subjects. But for the Romans, he was good because he kept a lid on the place. The Romans, remember, knew well about the Jewish revolt against the Assyrians, which had only happened a couple hundred years before. So it wasn't that long, maybe 150. So they knew this was a restive people, and so they needed this kind of brutality. Well, here's what happens now. We have Herod. He goes until the year 4 BCE, and he dies. And when he dies, he has this grand procession from Jericho to Herodion, where he's now buried. It was one of his palaces. And yet, pretty soon, right after that, his gravesite was ransacked, and his sarcophagus was crushed. It was recently found about 10 years ago. And what happened at that point then is that the place fell into, I don't know, anarchy. And if you have to use a modern analogy, it would be like Iraq after Saddam Hussein, right? So warlords and religious fanatics and all these different kinds of people just vying for power, trying to scrape out with everybody else just trying to scrape out a living, right? So it was really kind of chaotic. In the meantime, we have back in Babylonia, it's not under Roman control, and so scholarship continues there, and Jews are thriving there, as they have been for almost 500 years by this point, right? From the original exile, Jews begin to, in these other areas, begin to establish their Judaism, not necessarily always going to the temple to do their sacrifices, which was really the system by which Jews understood to worship, but they would have little places. These are synagogues, early kind of proto-synagogues in communities. If you couldn't schlep all the way to Jerusalem, you could at least gather and read Torah and things like that and study. This is when we had rabbis, the famous rabbis like Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Shammai, many of these famous rabbis. Most of them are back in Babylonia, not in Judea itself. All right? Now, because it was such a barbaric time with Rome putting in kind of an increasingly brutal set of governors here, trying to kind of hold the lid on the place, there were Jews that were beginning to look back to the prophets and establish this sense of apocalyptic nature. The book of Daniel was written during the Maccabean Wars, okay, during the Hasmonean Wars against the Assyrian, and it talks about Babylonia, but that's only because they needed to reference that and not have it be talking about the Assyrian kings. So it was really about an apocalyptic kind of a peek into heaven, but the end of times is near type of a thing. And Jews started to kind of look at that and began to sense that the end of times was kind of coming, maybe in their lifetime. And they really, really began to believe that. Many of them did. And that's where we started to take some of the things that were standard for Jewish understanding and begin to switch it a little bit. We began to write that down in the form of the Mishnah. This was the oral tradition that was passed down teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. I'm just saying that we had the Torah, the same 5 books of Moses here, but we had the oral law that was transmitted orally, but that began to be written down here because it seemed to be very fragile, and maybe it might even go away if the end of times were to actually come. So running around during this time period were the sects, S-E-C-T-S. These are described by Josephus and other contemporary people. Josephus, the historian. More about him in a second, but I want to go ahead and tell you who these people were, because you know, if you're a Christian, you're kind of familiar with some of this stuff, but I'm not sure if you're fully familiar with it. And if you're Jewish, you're probably not familiar with it at all, except that it doesn't seem right to you because it doesn't resonate today. But in fact, it should resonate very much today. So we have the Sadducees, and there were probably 30 of these sects. I've given you kind of the top 5, so to speak. But the Sadducees were centered around the temple rites and rituals of the sacrificial system. And they held themselves as descendant from Zadok, that King David's original priest, right? That's where that name we think comes from, Sadducees, from Zadok. So they thought that they were kind of heirs to the priesthood, okay? And that they were gonna do it just like it's been done for 1,000 years, or ever since there's been a tabernacle. They're gonna keep on doing it that way, and the sacrificial system to them was paramount. That is what they were focused on. That's really all they were focused on. Then we have the Pharisees, and the Pharisees began to emerge after during and after the Maccabean Wars. They began to adapt the Torah to kind of, we gotta do it. We gotta look at it kind of like adapt it for our times. And I'll give you an example of what the Pharisees did. So you can't work on the Sabbath, right? Right? Well, that meant that you couldn't go to battle or even defend yourself on the Sabbath. And so during the Maccabean Wars, they changed that. They said, forget that. We're gonna go to war on the Sabbath if we have to protect ourselves. So you can violate a Torah commandment, in other words, to save your life or the life of your family. So that was an adaptation that occurred. They began to adapt many other things. They began to look at the prophets, the Nevi'im, and they would look at that and say, you know, that there's hints here about resurrection of the dead. There's hints in here about the idea about an ingathering of Jews eventually from Babylonia. That will eventually occur, the bodily resurrection, and that the end of times were coming. But that the Torah and the oral law were all kind of living laws. They were reformers. They were reformers. They were changing Judaism and the thinking about Judaism into a kind of a construct of righteous and ethical behavior that did not, they certainly bought into the sacrificial system, but it wasn't their entire focus. Then we have the Essenes. The Essenes were like, I don't know if you know this, I hope I can tell this joke, Rob, but it was told to me by somebody that was not Jewish, so I think I can say it. So we go to heaven, and you're looking around, and you're being shown around. So these are the Catholics over here, and they're doing their thing, and these are the Methodists over here, they're doing this thing, and then they peek into a door, and these are the Baptists in here, and the person starts to walk through, and shh, don't. And so the Essenes were much the same. They thought they had it right, and everybody else had it wrong. And they were ascetic. They were highly concerned with purity. So when you go to Qumran, I'll show you some pictures. There's a ton of mikvot there, or mikvahs there, and they were just highly concerned with that. They were really concerned with the end of days. They really thought they were going to do it. They thought they were going to be coming out to battle. They were the sons of light. They were going to go out in battle against the sons of darkness. Very apocalyptic. You know, Revelations kind of takes that imagery a little bit when it was written a couple hundred years later. And then we have the Zealots. The Zealots were, they hearkened themselves from the Maccabees that successfully threw off the Assyrians. They thought they could start the same thing and then throw off the Roman yoke. Could possibly go wrong. God is on our side. That was their view. And then there were many other. And the Sicarii were a kind of a subset. They were actually assassins. They murdered high priests. They really did. They thought that if they thought that you were not with them, then you were against them.
Special forces.
They kind of were.
That is the precursor of the word sicario in Spanish.
Sicario in
Yes.
Spanish. Oh, this comes from that?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. And then there were others. There were what were called God-fearers. These were Gentiles, non-Jews. They believed in one God, but they didn't want to get circumcised. We have to keep kosher. Then there was the Jesus sect, which we'll talk a lot about them. And then there were secular Jews. All they wanted to do was feed their family, right? They didn't really care about going to the, making their pilgrimages to Jerusalem too much. They just needed to survive. So there were many others around, but this is an overview of them. Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity emerged from only one of these sects. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about them in a second. So this is Qumran, the plateau where the Dead Sea Scrolls were written and stored in these caves outside. This is from a visit that we made a few years ago with the family. And the caves are kind of scattered all over that area. And they were written from about 100 BC up to about 100 CE, so over about a 200-year period. And it really does inform the thinking of Jews of that time, or at least these people. So Herod dies, there's this kind of lawlessness and this anarchy that starts to occur, and Rome starts putting in these kind of governors, and they just get increasingly brutal through time because it's chaos. It's complete chaos. Is there somebody at the door? And during this time,
Well, it sounded like it came from the front.
we'll pause.
Check the front door.
She is.
It's the milkman.
Oh, Seth. All right, let's continue. So I want you to picture this, what's going on after Herod's death. Chaos, anarchy, lawlessness, warlords, religious fanatics, all occurring and popping up all over this area. This is the environment that Jesus was born into. Exactly. Also John the Baptist, others, but they become islands of history for us. So they were born into this kind of chaotic, lawless time. I want you to continue to remember that. And rebellion is in the air and sometimes on the ground. Because some of these kind of leaders, I think it's on the next slide, see these people here? So these are all mentioned by Josephus and other sources. So these are names and people that were leaders. They were religious leaders sometimes. They were military leaders, warlords kind of leaders. You don't know them because they are lost to history, but except that Josephus recorded them. Josephus and others recorded them. And they're all dead. They all got killed by the Romans. They all got killed by the Romans, as did John the Baptist and Jesus and many others, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I'm just trying to give you the air of what was going on at the time. So the Romans tolerated nothing, anything at all that smelled of a whiff of some kind of internal leadership among these restive Jews. They went right after them and they killed them. So they had their own special forces, if you will, and they would confront them openly in battle or go into their homes, take them, kill them, crucify them, along with their followers. So I'm going very fast up to this point. So this is kind of, I just covered basically from the Magna time right here, right up to Herod the Great appointed, and then here we have the ministry of Jesus. Now on this time, I'm going to slow down just for a second because we need to kind of give an important frame of reference. The New Testament, if you were to flip it open right now, you would see the Gospels first, Mark, Matthew, Luke, Acts, and then John. However, that is not chronologically the order that they came into existence. The first part of the New Testament is actually the letters of Paul. Now, though it's put later in the New Testament, but chronologically it occurs first. Talk about Paul in a second. So he starts writing his letters. Now, I'll give you the context in a second, about the mid-50s, early mid-50s. And then he continued writing them for about 13, 14 years, something like that. It was after that that we had this revolt. I'm going to talk about that. And then after that came Mark, Matthew, and the Gospel writers. So that's an important little thing to kind of keep in mind about the order that this all happened in. So we had Jesus and his ministry. He died 33 CE. That's kind of a consensus. Whether it was a 1-year ministry or a 3-year ministry, there's a little controversy about that. It doesn't matter. From our perspective, it doesn't matter. He dies, and then Paul, about 20 years later, starts traveling and writing his letters. Then there's a gigantic revolt against Rome. Then the Gospel writers. Make sense so far? That's the context. So Jesus was born into this time of anarchy and lawlessness. He was born, the Gospels say, in Bethlehem. There's a decent chance he was actually born in Nazareth because he lived in Nazareth. Bethlehem became something that was important because there was some predictions, some prophecy about the Mashiach coming from Bethlehem. So it may have been retroactively applied. It really doesn't matter to Jews. So he goes to Egypt and goes back. What does that sound like? Yeah, it sounds like Joseph. It sounds like Abraham, for that matter. Okay. So these are the stories about Jesus that were resonated with Jews at the time because, okay, I know that story. It's a similar story because I'm very, very familiar with. And he started his ministry either 30 or 32, something like that. He was baptized by John the Baptist, who we think was maybe an Essene, because he was really talking about the end of times a lot, and certainly influenced Jesus as well. And then we have all these things that we know about the sayings of Jesus, right? So we have these recordings of recordings. We have the record of Jesus saying a number of different things. And we're going to talk about all that, but I want to put him in context of the Jews at the time. And to the extent that, we Jews need to, believe that there was an actual historic Jesus, you should, I think. There famously, Jen and I know a congregant who is no longer living in Gastonia, but he famously said that Jesus was like a Mickey Mouse character made up. I think the broad consensus is that he was very real, and he had a ministry that was successful for a time. And that we'll kind of unpack all that later on. And all these things that he was saying throughout these times resonated with Jews of the time, very much so, because they were feeling like the end of times was developing. And if you watch, you scroll on your TikTok or your Facebook reels, and there are people that will say, just like, I don't know, 50 years ago, walking around with a sign on a corner, the end is coming, you know, I mean, people are still saying that now. And people were definitely saying it at the time. It's really no different. They really thought it and really honestly believed it. Many of them did. Now, here's the thing about what Jesus said, not what Jesus means to Christianity today, but what Jesus said. All these things here, these stories about ethics, and you just kind of go down here. The priesthood in Jerusalem, these Sadducees and some Pharisees, were so tied into that sacrificial system. They were appointed by the Romans. They were aristocratic families. They depended on them. They had to go to the Roman garrison every morning to pick up their vestments and to put their clothes on, do their thing during the day, go back and give the Romans back their vestments. So very, very tied into the politics of the day and wealth and money, and it just was not. And by the way, most Jews still thought these people were not the right heirs to the priesthood. They really thought, because remember the Simon the Maccabee, he combined the kingship and the priesthood, and that was just all wrong. So there was great resentment against this system of sacrifice, and that I had to schlep to Jerusalem, and I had to go, and I had to. I can't drag my lamb, you know, this whole way. I'm going to go there. I'm going to bring a few shekels. I'm going to buy a lamb, and then I'm going to go give it to the priest. That the priest will sacrifice it for me, and then he'll get to eat it. That's really kind of what the system was like. And you did it. Most people, or many people did it, but it did not have a good vibe. It did not feel good to many, many, many Jews. And that's what Jesus was rebelling against. So when he talks about the money changers in the temple, when he turns over the table, right, he's angry at this system, and he is channeling the anger and the disillusionment that many Jews were having at the time. This is one of the main reasons that he had a great success with his ministry, at least at first. So he did miracles, and you know very famously, I think I've got a picture of one here, I don't know, maybe not, but where he, you know, Lazarus, he raises from the dead. This is, you know, obviously he walks on water, loaves the fishes, and all these stories, but you have to remember that at the time, miracle worker was a job. It was an avocation. There were many of them running around. And if you think of today, there are people that are astrologers, and you can pay people to, you know, read your horoscope. Same thing. It was almost identical. It's really not any different. There were people that honestly believed that somebody could come in, you could give them some shekels, and they would cure your leprosy. Does that sound a little familiar? Right. So there are people now today that obviously believe the same thing. And so Jesus was one of many, 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 many. But again, with each miracle, he got more and more and more traction, I guess, right? He began to have a reputation for being able to do this and do this well. He talked a lot about the downtrodden and the poor, a lot. And then he was kind of giving out free health care, right? He was curing disease and leprosy and things like that. And he began the language about his Son of Man, Son of God, and I'm not going to kind of get into that too much because some of this was ascribed to him, some of this he may have said, but what he meant is, you know, still can be controversial, not among many Christians, of course, but among historians and people who do textual criticism and look at the New Testament. And he did talk about resurrection and the idea that he may be the Mashiach. When I say Mashiach, that just means anointed one. That's all it is. That's all it is, anointed one. So anointed one, oil on the head. So that was prophets get anointed, kings get anointed. Samuel was an anointed one. King David, King Solomon, King Saul, King Cyrus even, that Persian king, he was God's Mashiach, God's anointed one. And the idea was that there was going to be another King David character, another King David that would come in. He would come anointed like King David. And he would unite the Jews, bring them back from Babylonia, recreate the Jewish state. And that was what the Mashiach was, a person, not necessarily a God, not divine figure, but a person that was going to channel and be a descendant of King David, to do what King David did. And so this began to be ascribed possibly to Jesus too among his followers. But all of this language was very, very, very Pharisaic. I'm not saying he was a card-carrying Pharisee, nobody knows. When you think about who the Pharisees were, it's hard to know who they were because Josephus talks about them, and we don't, the term Pharisee, we're not even sure. We think what it means, and we think it's thought to translate into something like you stand apart or stand against. Well, who were they standing apart from, and who were they standing against? The Romans, pagans, or fellow Jews, like the Sadducees and the Essenes? It's not known. So just keep in mind that the identity of the Pharisees is still an area of scholarship. I'd like to, can I digress just for a second? Because I want to read you just this one tiny passage about King Herod. I just realized it when I flipped back. Because King Herod, it's an unbelievable story. It's Game of Thrones plus some. It really is.
Which Herod?
King Herod the Great. This is the original one I was talking about before. In December of 40 BCE, Herod stood in the midst of the Senate in Rome, an exotic stranger examined with curiosity by a crowd of Roman aristocrats who debated his future in a language he did not understand. He had come as a supplicant, seeking aid in rescuing his country from the Parthians, which are kind of the descendants of the Persian invaders that at that time occupied Jerusalem. His family had been left behind in desperate circumstances in a distant region of the world about which the senators knew and cared little. He brought with him no troops, just a small coterie of companions, no money. He had been in Rome for less than a week, and he had few acquaintances in the city and even fewer friends. But by the end of the day, he had been proclaimed King of Judea. That's the rest of the book. Unbelievable. You can't make it up. So I was reading this in bed with Janet, and going, oh my God. Anyway, so, all right. So fast forwarding a little bit. So Jesus' sayings were very Pharisaic, and I'm going to go ahead and give you a little bit of flavor. So when we think about some of the things that Jesus said, were they a little different than our kind of contemporary Jewish understanding, a little, but no different than others that were running around time? I'm going to give you a couple of clear examples of where he said things that were a little off, but not so off as to be not Jewish. So you know there are 3 commandments in the Torah, right? Love God, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might, love the stranger, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? So those are the 3 commandments to love. To that, Jesus added, love your enemy. Okay, so that's not Jewish, it's just extra. He said the thing about turning the cheek, so when I slaps you, then turn the other cheek. Well, Judaism is not a pacifist religion, but he was kind of pacifist himself. And so those are things that were not Jewish completely, but they were new, but they weren't radical, that radical. Making sense? It's a little so far?
Can you elaborate on turning the other cheek?
Yeah, so he was saying if somebody slaps you, just give them the other cheek to slap again.
Sure.
Okay? Where Judaism would say, traditional Judaism would say, well, that was an injustice, and you can't let injustice stand. There has to be a consequence to being slapped, or basically somebody taking action against you. You don't sit there and just take it. Whereas he was saying, he was basically an advocate of pacifism.
And that's basically because of who he was as a person.
Insofar as we know. Now, that's not, when you get to later writings, like Revelations, he's a sword, fire-breathing, kind of a guy, so it changes. But here at the time, during this ministry, as it's recorded in the Gospels, he was pacifist. To give to Rome what belongs to Rome. You have money, just let him have it. Don't worry about money. So he was very much like that. All right, so it's important to understand that he was Pharisaic, as was everybody that followed him in his ministry. Peter, who was formerly named Simon, and James, that's the people that took the church after Jesus had died. And I'm going to put this thing up here. This is important because as you know, in the New Testament, and we're going to get to that there are depictions of Jesus being kind of at Jews, and I'm going to show you the passages. But in reality, he was trying to support the temple, right? He was trying to change it. He was trying to reform it, and the temple rites and rituals and everything else. So he was not trying to repudiate Jewish practices at the time, but support it along the way. But there was huge opposition to from the zealots and including some of the Pharisees. But he was not alone, because many did. So here we have Pilate comes in. Now he is the most brutal of all these Roman governors, and he is so brutal that actually in 36, this is after Jesus was crucified at his order, that he was brought back to Rome because he was too brutal. They really thought that you're overdoing it. You're going to create the very rebellion that you're trying to prevent by being too brutal to these people. And that's exactly what happened, but that's how brutal he was. So I have to say that the idea that he was, during the trial and the crucifixion of Jesus, and all the things that we know about in the Passion, which is those few days that occurred right around Jesus coming into Jerusalem and then being beaten and flogged and eventually crucified, when it has Pilate washing his hands of it and his wife saying he's innocent, all of that, it very frankly kind of buggers the imagination a little bit, that this man who was took no quarter with anybody, anytime, ever. And he lived, by the way, in Caesarea, the palace that Herod had built, and that's where he lived. You can go visit that palace now. It's been unearthed. But during the festival season and the pilgrimage season, yeah, he came to Jerusalem because that was a time of trouble, because there were so many Jews, and he was afraid of a rebellion starting. So from a historical perspective, the idea that he kind of washed his hands of Jesus and all this and made the Jews say crucify him, it doesn't resonate very well with the historicity that we know about this guy. So at the time, and when all of this stuff gets to, these accounts began to be written, as you will see in the timeline, that these accounts were written starting in 70 and beyond, when early Christians were starting to be persecuted, like Romans were persecuting everybody that looked like they were a threat. And these gospel writers were trying to say, it's not us. Don't worry about us. It's the Jews from whom we are broken off from that you have to worry about. So they were giving a message to the Roman governors and Roman authorities at the time, don't worry about us. And so they wrote things in a way that depicts Jews in a negative light. When Jesus died, as I mentioned, the church passed to his brother James and then Peter, who his original name was Simon. Now, these are still Jews, y'all. These are still Jews. They are not Christians. There isn't Christian. It's still a sect of Jews. There was, he had a following, a lot of following. The following shrunk dramatically down to a small kernel of people led by these two men. And the reason it shrunk so dramatically down to this kind of kernel of people was because all those things that one would hope that he was going to do, be this King David character, and throw off the Roman yoke, and there would be peace on earth, lion laying down with the lamb, and swords in the plowshares, that there would be resurrection of the dead. That's Ezekiel, dry bones, that passage, that Jews would ingather and come from Babylonia. None of that happened. And so it was another disappointment, that long list of people that I gave you that had been already killed, including John the Baptist. Well, it was just another disappointment to most Jews, not to a dedicated few, but to most Jews living in this time, in this place. And so the movement shrank down, still a Jewish sect. Now, Paul comes along, and his original name was Saul, and you often hear about the term a conversion on the road to Damascus. Well, he didn't convert to Christianity. There was no such thing at the time. However, he did see a heavenly Jesus. And when he saw the heavenly Jesus, he changed his name to Paul, and he started to visit communities outside of Judea to give this message about God and Jesus and the relationship. But I want to make sure you understand that he was giving a different kind of message than the message that Peter and James were giving at the Jerusalem church. He went all the way through, and James in the Jerusalem church and Paul outside of that, in Turkey, Greece, and the Mediterranean, started to have different messages. And the Peter and James had their emissaries going out too. Those letters are lost. We don't know what they actually said, but they were at odds to the point that at one point they called Paul back and made him go to a mikveh because he was starting to say things that they did not buy into. Like, you still have to be Jewish. Peter and James said you have to be Jewish. You still have to be circumcised and keep kosher. And then you still have this personage of Jesus to help get you to heaven. So it makes sense. It's not a question.
Yeah, so when Paul is visiting all these communities,
Yeah.
and writing these letters, is he talking to Jews?
He's talking to a mixed communities. Yeah, hold that thought, just one sec.
Is that kind of what the messianic?
So this will do this. So this was the difference in between what Simon and James were saying and what Paul was saying. So Simon and James, starting off with, they, like Jews, and today, even like modern Orthodox Jews, are waiting for a time when God's heavenly kingdom comes to earth. And then we have peace on earth here. Makes sense? That's what traditional Jews thought then, and that's what we think today. Or that's what we Orthodox Jews will think anyway. Whereas Paul was talking about humanity going up to heaven to be with God and Jesus. That's what his vision. So it's opposite, right? He was saying you don't have to keep kosher, you don't have to be circumcised, you don't have to know Hebrew. That you can enjoy this just by having faith in Jesus. That is how you get it, not through the practices of Judaism. Does that make sense? And so I said, James and Simon called Paul back because this was almost to them heresy, almost
Apocalyptic?
apostasy is the word, right? It was going against what they were teaching. So they were very much, and famously in Antioch, there was kind of a food fight, like literally, because the idea was, okay, can the Jews and the non-Jews sit together? Well, James and Peter would say no, because they're not keeping kosher. You got to keep kosher. And Paul was saying, it's fine, don't worry about it. The food is not the issue here, okay? And they got into this big battle over it, literally kind of a food fight. So that's what was happening during these times. And there was this argument about kind of what began to be the kernels of the Christianity that was going to emerge. All of them, though, thought that this was going to happen, that this heavenly kingdom, whether it was coming down to earth or humanity going up to heaven, was going to occur in their lifetime. Like it was imminent, like it's going to happen any moment now, like literally. And today, of course, you still have people who will be saying that. And even in the Jewish tradition, there's a midrash from the Talmud that says you better be righteous every day because the Messiah could come every day. The Mashiach could come any minute. So you have to act like today, like he's going to be here tomorrow. So that even that's in the Jewish tradition. And they thought it actually very real. It was going to happen in their lifetimes, imminent.
So Paul
Mhm.
is like early Reformed Jews.
Okay, so hold that thought. Hold that thought. So he traveled all over the Mediterranean. You can see some of the places, right? So Corinthians and Ephesians and all these places, Thessalonica and Philippi. So these were all towns and cities that he lived, and he just traveled all over. He made like 3 or 4 like sweeps through the Mediterranean. And he ended up at Rome, which I'll tell you about. But he did it, and he would visit these communities, he would give his message, and essentially, so he'd write letters sometimes before, and then many of his letters were sometimes right after leaving. And I'll tell you why his letters had some of the tone that they did. So this is the earliest part of the New Testament, even though the Gospels come first in the New Testament. Of Paul's letters, at least half of them are probably real. It's a real window into first century Judaism, right? It's really kind of cool if you want to think about it for a second. So these go back 2,000 years, these authentic letters. And then there's others that are probably pieces and parts of letters that other people kind of put together and maybe elaborated, and a few of them probably not Pauline at all. And so we just have to recognize they were writing in his name, and it got attached to the canon, but they may not have been literally his hand. This is all written in Greek. All right, so to the question, Alan's question, was it Pharisaic, kind of Reformed Jewish? And some of it was, and some of it wasn't. So he was going into these communities and he was talking to these mixed communities, right? So there were these God-fearing people. They were coming, this was in a pagan land, right? Out in Corinth, right? Out in Turkey, modern day Turkey and Greece. So they were still very much about the Greek gods and the Persian gods and the Parthian gods. They had a pantheon of gods. And yet those gods gave no ethical structure at all, right? Those gods played with people down here, right? All those mythological stories, they're all just about nothing ethical and moral about them. Do you know what I mean? And so people were hungry for this kind of ethical grounding, and having a one God would give it to them. And certainly there was, messaging, and Jews were living there, so they kind of understood the Jews that were worshiping here. This is all part of that diaspora. So there were these mixed communities Paul was visiting. And then what would happen is there were disagreements that happened like when he was there. And I'm giving to you in a nutshell a little bit, but he would get it all kind of straightened out from his perspective. He would give them the word, give them directions, give them instruction, and then he would leave. This is how it's done. You don't have to keep kosher. You don't have to celebrate these holidays. You don't have to get circumcised. And then he would learn when he left that they were going back to observing Yom Kippur, that they were doing Pesach still, that type of thing. That people were still, the communities would say, well, if you're really going to be a part of us, you got to get circumcised first. Well, that was not what he just got through saying. He just got through saying you don't have to do that. And now he writes these letters that are really a tongue lashing or a finger wagging at these communities. I just got through saying, and he just kind of got angry, to be honest with you. That's what happened with his letters. And they became to be ill-tempered. And so he had this argument going on with those communities. He had arguments going on with Peter and James back in Jerusalem. So he was just in a foul mood a lot of the time, one would think, okay? And he writes things like this. This is in 1 Thessalonians, which is considered a genuine Pauline letter. And then he writes, on the other hand, when he's in a good mood, he writes things like this, right? So you find both. So you find this ill-tempered and intemperate stuff, but then you find things supporting him. So if you're a Christian, you're going to be looking at it, and you can cherry pick, and you can say, well, gee, Paul's talked about we're just grafted onto your tree. That's why you love the Jews. Or you can do this if you're an anti-Semite. It's very hard. You can start getting cognitive dissonance with Paul. And that's why some preachers, I'm not talking about Robert here because I have no idea, I've never talked to him, but they kind of distance themselves from Paul, but they don't focus on Paul. They focus on the Gospels, but that presents its own problem. So now Hebrews is one that was not ascribed to Paul, but I'll just let you read that. And you can just see, this is the beginnings, what we call supersessionism, the beginnings of language where it's starting to refer back to some of the prophets, Jeremiah in this case, saying that our covenant is going to supersede yours, the Jewish covenant. Remember, this is in the year 55 or 60, right? This is like 20 years after Jesus' ministry. And already we start to have this kind of percolating sense that this is the new way to go, and your way is old. So it's already beginning. Remember, Paul probably didn't write this one. And then the way Christianity has kind of synthesized this thing is that, so Jesus and James were really ministering to Jews in Judea. They did not have a good time of it. They were not very successful, is what I'm saying. And Paul was out to the Gentiles, as if they were giving the same message, but they were not. They were two different kinds of messages, and they were arguing with each other. There were these big disagreements, and it got really into the nitty-gritty about the meaning of Jesus, the purpose of Jesus, not just what he said at the temple, the Sermon on the Mount, but really, what does it mean? And Peter and James continue to maintain you still have to be Jewish before you can come into our community. And Paul was saying no. And at the end of the day, this idea about who gets to go to heaven, Peter and James were saying that you get to go if you have lived a faithful life, and you have, and when you're done, you get to go to this heavenly kingdom. And Paul says at any time you become part of that heavenly kingdom by simply accepting that Jesus died for your sins. So the idea of vicarious atonement, he begins to develop. So they would argue, and that was going on the entire time. Now, Peter was eventually arrested by the Romans and James. They were both executed. Peter was taken all the way to Rome and executed, and the tradition is that he was executed upside down in the year about 64. And then Paul was arrested and taken up to, and that was right after the Great Fire. So Nero, Rome burned, Nero fiddled, okay? So they started to, I guess, historically, how much Nero really believed on this little burgeoning Christian community, who knows? But it is pretty well established that he was killed, probably crucified, and legend says upside down in Rome. And then Paul was arrested in Caesarea. And then because he was a Roman citizen, he said, I want to go to Rome. They took him to Rome. And he goes, and then he sits in jail for a few years, and he is to also executed, and he's beheaded. So this is all going on. The Romans are doing all this stuff. Remember, we're starting to creep up. This is 64, 65, and guess what? In 66, the revolt starts. The rebellion starts. The first great revolt against Rome. And this was really by the Zealots and the Sicarii. They really, really thought that God was on our side. We're going to be victorious, just like the Maccabees were against the Assyrians about 200 years before, about 150 years before. So very much like thinking about the Civil War or something. I mean, it's just not that long ago to them. Now, not everybody thought it was a good idea. The Pharisees definitely did not. The Jesus sect definitely did not. It was very small in the Roman Empire at the time. And the Sadducees in Jerusalem, they did not think it was a good idea because they were beholden to the Romans. They didn't want to be part of that kind of nonsense. And then most Essenes were not sure. Is this the end of days? Is this the final battle between sons of light, sons of darkness? Some said yes, and they went out to battle. Most said no, and they stayed out in the desert out there. And then there was this guy named Josephus, and he was actually a general for the Jews. And he fortified several cities up in the north, in the Galilee, because Romans landed their legions, and they come in Lebanon, and they just kind of marched down, and he got captured up in the Galilee. It's a whole story about that. And later, he wrote books about the Jewish wars, the Jewish revolt against Rome, as well as the antiquities of Jews. So he became a Roman historian and very wealthy, and many years later wrote these books. He's got kind of this mix, so he's writing it for his Roman patrons, that's who's paying him, he's living in Rome. But on the other hand, he's still Jewish, and he still has this affinity for his Jewish people, so you see this kind of mixed loyalty in his writings sometimes. But for all of these, the thing that lit it off for the Zealots and the Sicarii were that Nero needed, because he's fighting civil war and stuff all over his empire, he raised the temple treasury. And that was when the Zealots said, enough is enough, and we're going to start this war. And they were very, 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 very uncompromising. And if you need a modern day analogy to this, can you think of a religious movement today that is uncompromising, will kill its own people if it feels like it has to achieve its goals, or a caliphate? Okay, it's ISIS, right? Taliban. That is, I am not really exaggerating when I say that they were just as fanatical in their goals, including fratricide, killing their own people, in order to accomplish what they thought was the right thing to do. And it was religiously motivated, but they also politically, they wanted to throw it off. And that the idea of creating another Jewish state, very much like the caliphate, and ISIS would want to create a caliphate, modern day caliphate. So it starts and it goes, and very quickly, Vespasian puts these cities down one by one by one by one, all the way down. And then finally they get to Jerusalem, lay it to siege, and within a short period of time, it's a bloodbath. And there's tremendous Jewish fighting. The Zealots and the Sicarii inside the city, like if you wanted to escape, forget it, they'll kill you first. And Rabbi Ben Zakkai snuck himself out. A legend has it he snuck himself out in a casket to go talk to Vespasian sitting outside the walls to help spare the city. And he flattered Vespasian. You're brilliant, you're great, you're terrific. Please spare the city. Vespasian said, no, but I like you, and so you can leave. And so he let him go. And Zakkai, you'll see in a minute, he became a tremendous leader after this war was over. But Jerusalem eventually was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. Jews were killing Jews. And this was celebrated eventually by Titus actually finished it up. And this is the Arch of Titus in Rome. And right inside the Arch of Titus is the relief here talking about, where the soldiers are taking the temple. So we know that that's the symbol of Judaism, not the Star of David at the time. It's the menorah, the six-armed menorah, just like we have here. So it was terrible. And then after that, they hung corpses all around, crucified tens of thousands of people. So it was a horrible, horrible, horrible experience. And you can't imagine. So if you were thinking the end of days were coming, you are thinking now, here they are. We're in it. We are deep in it. I showed you this picture. This is my family at one of those cities outside in the Galilee. This is Gamla, and it's a hill. It was a city shaped like a camel's hump. The Sea of Galilee is way, way out here. And when you focus in, this is the excavations. There was a whole city here. And there was a gigantic battle here depicted by, and written about by Josephus. Because we think he was watching it, but these are the walls that he built. He fortified the city here. And the legend is that the Romans eventually forced all the defenders and the city people up to the tip, and they threw themselves off the other side. So it's a little bit like a mass suicide type of a thing. Kind of harkens back to Masada. It's called Masada in the north. It's a little visited archaeological site, but unbelievable. If you go, you should definitely go here. All right, so the zealots and Sicarii flee to Masada, or at least that was the narrative that I understood for my entire life. It turns out, this book was written last year. There's a little bit more to the story. They were occupying Masada for 4 years already. They were up there, and they were living up there and raiding Jewish towns and cities, because it's obviously a desert plateau up there, for food. And they were killing people that weren't giving them their homage of food and stuff. So they were battling their own people to stay alive up here. The siege that occurred up here, history has it, this is Hannah and Tori 10 years ago, maybe longer than that. That's the Dead Sea out there. So you're supposed to climb. The big thing to do is to kind of climb the snake path and get up there by sunrise, right? So, and that's my nephew Jordan, overlooking Jordan, which is over here, right? Okay. That's my family. And here's what it kind of looked like at the time. And then this is down here. And this is the Roman encampments outside. So it's all preserved very, very well. And here's the ramp they used to kind of get up. And history has it that it took 3 years to build that ramp with Jewish slaves. In fact, they probably did it in a few weeks, or months, but not 3 years. So the kind of the historicity of the bold resistance up there, and then committing mass suicide so they didn't get taken prisoner. That's all written by Josephus. We're going to take some of it with a grain of salt. Certainly it was a battle up there, but it was done. And after that was done, that was it. That was the last remnants of any Jewish resistance. And so now you have to think about the people that are living in this area. They had to decide what the hell just happened? How did this happen? What did God mean for this to happen, to let this happen? And it was an existential crisis of epic proportions. But it was no different than the same existential crisis in 586 BCE, 500 years before, when the Assyrians, the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. And the Jews and the area began to try to answer this question. The Pharisees retreated to Yavne, and it's on the coast. And Rabbi Zakkai was the leader of that. The Jesus sect, what was left of them, left, and they went into an area that is also excavated in modern day Jordan, this town called Pella. The Sadducees, what happened to them? They dead. They were in Jerusalem. They were all killed. They ceased to exist at that point. None. And that meant no temple, no place to sacrifice, no priest to do the sacrifice for you. The sacrificial system ended in an instant. So we've been around, we think, for 3,800 years. So for almost 2,000 years up to this point, we had a sacrificial system. And in an instant, it disappears. And we're trying to understand what to do now. What does it mean? What do we do now? There's Pella. And I put Mark here because Mark is the first gospel writer. And Mark probably, there are some people that believe, like if I have some of these reference materials up here, believe he was actually in Jerusalem, just managed to survive, or was sitting on hills outside of it, watching it burn, watching the blood flow, watching the temple being destroyed. At the very least, he talked to firsthand witnesses of it. Matthew 2. These were Jews, these two guys. If you don't think that, so Mark is obviously a Jewish name. Is it? No. Matthew is a Greek name, but Mattathias, that was the same name that the guy who started off the Maccabean, his name was Mattathias, so it's the same, so Jews. So when you look at Mark in chapter 13, and this language that you see here, he's putting these words in Jesus' mouth, right? So Jesus, he's writing as if Jesus was saying this in the year 32, let's say. But in reality, at the very least, they were watching it happen and put these words in Jesus' mouth as a, not as a prophecy, but actually what they were witnessing themselves. But I'll tell you, there's a way that it could have been a prophecy too, kind of. So this is a quote from one of these books up in here, and that's what I was just saying. It must have felt to these people like it definitely was the end of the world to them, thinking about some of the language of the prophets, especially Daniel. Now, this is in Matthew, it's some of the same language. So when you look at the idea about, all right, well, they're not writing, that's not a prophecy, they're writing about what they're witnessing, what they just saw, just putting it in Jesus' mouth so it looks like a prophecy. Or even if it was a prophecy and Jesus was going to say this was going to happen 50 years from now, well, it had happened already once before, right? The Babylonian. So Jesus well knew that story 500 years before. So, it would have resonated even if he was truly predicting it, that it was not a stretch because they had already happened once. So here's the destruction of the temple. And you have to think of the Gospels and the writings and the Jewish writings that came after this as kind of wartime literature. And I understand that there's a number of things that I can say with some confidence, and I don't want to speak for all Christians everywhere for all time. That's a very dangerous thing. I don't like doing it for Jews. But I think that it's fair to say most Christians don't understand the context of the Gospels. Like this war that happened and the near destruction of the Jewish people at the time is not part of the narrative. It's not part of the context of the New Testament. But that's when they started to be written down. Not Paul, that came before, but Mark and Matthew and after. So we had to have this religious reinvention, the same thing, had to undergo it again after the same way we did after the Babylonian destruction of the first temple. And you have to keep going. You have to have this renewal out of laws. But we had these two groups of people. You had the Pharisees that had managed to survive this war out on the coast, and then you had the Jesus sect sitting in Pella in Jordan, and they answered this question: what was going to be their religious reinvention? What were they going to renew? What were they going to conclude from it? And the Jesus people said, well, this happened because Jews have rejected Jesus as they were conceiving him, Son of God, and so on, and Messiah. But the Pharisaic rabbis answered it differently. They answered it the same way they did after the destruction of the first temple 500 years before. That we strayed, we were insufficiently righteous. We did not listen and follow Torah and the prophets sufficiently well enough. And just like it happened 500 years ago, God has decreed it to happen here. So what do? Well, we need to double down. We need to focus more on righteousness. We need to focus on things besides the sacrificial system. There was no more way to do sacrifices, to get away from that. And we do instead the sacrifice of our lips. That's prayer and study and Gemilut Chasadim, acts of loving kindness, righteousness. Whereas the Jesus sect concluded differently. That Jesus was actually in the temple, that he died for sins. And that when they started to write, if you had just survived that, and you read this, and you were already, let's say you were Jesus sect adjacent, let's say, okay? Would this not resonate with you? I suspect that it would. right? That we were insufficiently faithful to Jesus even after all he had done for us, including dying for us. And because now the narrative was changing, all those things I mentioned, resurrection of the dead, peace on earth and all that kind of stuff, and the heavenly kingdom, all of that, well, that will come when he comes back, right? Because now we have the story about Jesus resurrected, right? The Easter story. And so that's when it'll happen when he kind of comes back. So the narrative did a twist, right? This was no longer Jewish, okay? And so the break between the Jesus sect as Jews was starting to become a rift, like a big rift. And because that was definitely not Jewish. So that's the messaging that was now among these other sects, not within Judea, but outside where Paul had visited. So all the way up through Turkey, Greece, and the Mediterranean. Making sense so far? Okay. So we look at the destruction of the temple as Tisha B'Av, it's a time of great mourning, but also recognizing we survived these things. So that's the message that we have of Jews. For Christians, it was proof that Jesus was who they were now saying he was, and what he meant, and what his meaning was, and what it meant for lives going forward. So this is what the early Christians, now we can begin to call them that. They really weren't yet. They did not call themselves that yet, but they were becoming distinct enough from Jews that we can call the early church. And because of that catastrophe, just like the Gospels were starting to write down what was probably an oral tradition that had been, well, it had to be, right? Because we don't have there's no CD of Jesus's, whatever he said at the temple of the Sermon on the Mount, am I right? So what he said had been passed down through a couple of generations by now. And now they were starting to write it down in the form of the Gospels. The Gospel writers were writing it down, so they're recording what they had heard and what the oral tradition was. Well, now the Jews started to do the same thing. They took the oral tradition and it became the Mishnah.
It was just in the air. It was just what people were doing.
Teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student, right? But the whole teacher, for the Jews, the teacher to student thing was fragile, right? Because we had just lost, a lot of teachers, right? And so they felt like they had to write it down to be able to preserve it. And now we have the gospel writers starting to write their things. So just kind of get you the timeline real quick. So Paul, remember, was before. Mark is probably at the time or just after the war ended. And then Matthew, just 10, 15 years later. Luke, Acts. Blood Revelation, I guess. I'm sorry about that. And then John. And then we have all kinds of other gospels that were not included in canon. We'll talk about that in just a second. But that's the order of things, okay? So keep in mind that by the time we get to these, Revelations and John, the rift is now becoming a gulf, right? It's between Jews and these new Jesus people, early Christians are becoming a rift. Those were all written in Greek, by the way, and whereas the Mishnah was written in Hebrew and Aramaic. So I'm not going to go into what the Mishnah is, but it is kind of our first commentary, and this is where you'll find a lot of the stuff about Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai and the transmission of our scripture and things like that. I'm not going to kind of go into it, but it started to be written down now, and it got fully written down within about another 100 years or so, something like that. I'm not going to spend time here talking about it. But it's kind of a big search engine, so it puts it into chapters and kind of sub-chapters, and you can kind of look stuff up. But it was written mostly in Babylonia, not in Israel, not in the modern day, because there weren't many Jews left there. There were still some, but their areas of scholarship had been shrunken down greatly. Later on, we started to kind of add to it, and that became the Talmud. So going from about 200 up to about 500, again, mostly written in Babylonia. Because remember, the Romans weren't there. They didn't put there was a lot of scholarship going on in Babylonia, and because they were thriving there. So here we are, going from about the year 80 or so up to about the year 100, and these disagreements are being written down, they're being recorded, and these are arguments going on in these communities, and they are getting bad. They're getting really bad. The more time goes on, the more gospels that are written, the more arguments that ensue and get recorded, the worse they are. And you have to understand, if you think about this, like a couple getting divorced, and they are arguing not just about the kids, but with the kids being present. Who's going to get the kids? but they're fighting with each other, and everybody hears it, witnesses it. And it just gets more bitter and more bitter and more bitter. So the further we get from Mark, Matthew, Luke, Revelations, and John, the further we get into that, the worse it is, and the worse Jews are depicted along the way. By the time John writes what he writes, in about the year 100, he starts off, this is like chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning there was the Word was with God, the Word was God. That means Jesus was God. That was it. Final straw, total, complete break from Judaism. It only took about 30 years to happen, from about 70, so a generation. Boom, done. Does it make sense? So we have these two versions of Judaism, and in 30 years, one generation, there's now two separate religions. And written into the words, into the mouths of the Pharisees of the time that Jesus was talking to, the accusation of blasphemy. Like, if you don't support what we're saying, that's blasphemous. Or that the Pharisees were now calling Jesus blasphemous, right? So you can see how they're now putting Jesus at odds with Pharisees, even though he was Pharisaic himself. So this is from one of these sources up in here. And when you see the New Testament, they'll talk about the Pharisees, the scribes, the Herodians, priests, elders, whatever. It's all lumped in together. These are just Jews. These are just Jews, and Jewish leaders specifically, but Jews at large. And they depict Jesus being pitted against the Pharisees at the time. And why the Pharisees? Why did they pick so much on the Pharisees? Because the Essenes were down in the desert, the Sadducees were dead, the Zealots were dead, there were nobody else. Pharisees were Jews, Jews were Pharisees, and that's it. So these discussions that are being recorded and put, it doesn't matter if they're calling a scribe or a Pharisee, they're Jewish leaders and they're pitted against Jews, and it's nothing more than an idea that Jews we argue all the time. Do we not argue like all the time? Like, come to a board meeting, right? So,
At least two opinions.
so there's no lie. So that's actually what this is that you put two Jews in a room, you get three opinions. We're used to argue. That's what the Talmud is. The Talmud, is nothing more than recording a dispensation of arguments about certain scriptural points. And there's a prevailing view, but the dissent is also recorded. The argument is recorded, and then the prevailing view. Rabbi so-and-so said this, Rabbi so-and-so said this, and Rabbi so-and-so said this, and this is what we do. But the dissent is there. So it's, from our perspective, to sit there and argue about who Jesus was and what he meant and, what he means and all this kind of stuff is very Jewish, right? Very Jewish. But the way the Gospels are written, it depicts them as being against Jesus and against what Jesus stood for. They put words in his mouth that remember, would have actually been uttered 50 years before, 60 years before. So we have to wonder, and if you're a textual critic, you will say that words were put into Jesus' mouth that he may not have uttered. Now, a committed Christian will not buy that. But just from a historicity point, it's likely. Okay, so we had this kind of split by that time. And Jesus was now equal with God, and we had two separate religions now. We had the beginnings of Rabbinic Judaism, and then we had the early Christian church. Now there were when we had this early Christian church, they weren't uniform in holding who Jesus was and what he meant and everything else. So these groups they thought he was Mashiach, but they did not think he was the Son of God. They did not ascribe divinity to him. And they lasted for another few hundred years. They finally died out in like the 500s or so. So it wasn't universally held among all these groups about everything. There was still a lot of different kinds of opinions to all these different groups. John is one of the more difficult ones because by this time, as I said, the rift was complete. The arguments were the most bitter they could possibly be. And he had Jesus saying some very, very uncharitable things, including these two actually. And this has begun to inform, anti-Jewishness, Christian anti-Jewish sense. I should make sure you understand, and I know you know intuitively, that anti-Judaism predates this by 2,000 years. Can you say Pharaoh, right? And okay, can you say Antiochus? You know, that's the Maccabee guy, you know? So anti-Jewishness has been around forever since there were Jews, but this is the beginning of Christian anti-Semitism, when they have John saying this kind of stuff. When they had Jesus saying this kind of stuff. And this is the author of one of these books too, and I love the quote. He was saying that, like, if you could go, like, even if John said that, and he was mad, he was having an argument, for crying out loud, and you have these Jews that were just not listening, they weren't getting it, they weren't buying it, they weren't seeing it his way. And then he wrote his gospel. Let's say he wrote it exactly like that, it was him and it's genuine. That you would hope that if he were to know the impact of that has transmitted down through the centuries to today, that he would say, oh, please delete that little sentence from my gospel, please. Because that's not what I meant to happen, and that's not really what I meant. I was just mad, right? So one hopes that would be the case. And we have all the way down here, you can read the slide, but I put this on here again from one of these books because it's a matter of Christians not only teaching some of this stuff, not only teaching it, and therefore aiding and abetting anti-Semitism, but by not confronting it and not looking at these difficult passages and addressing it from the pulpit and their religious schools and their adult study. So it's like the sin of omission. They continue to let it fester a little bit by not doing that. There was another Jewish revolt here in the diaspora against Rome, a second Jewish revolt in cities throughout the Roman Empire. And then there was a third Jewish revolt. And this one, Simon Bar Kokhba, you know the famous Rabbi Akiva? We read about him so he was brilliant. He knew nothing. He couldn't read. He was brilliant. He was like one of the most famous rabbis of all time. But when the idea about Bar Kokhba being the Mashiach, the King David character who was going to unite the Jews and bring everybody back, he went along with it. That's like his biggest blunder, right? Am I right, Charlie? I'm right about that? Yeah, so thank you. Oh, good. So he was a brilliant scholar, but he made a mistake here because this one here, this revolt, was initially successful. They printed coins because they thought they had done it.
This is one of them.
Okay, a Bar Kokhba coin. The problem was, okay, so they defeated a couple of Roman garrisons that were sitting around and not paying too much attention. Can you say Gaza or outside of Gaza? You know those. So that was the first of it. And then what happened was all they did was land their legions, and it was about like Gaza. And they literally scraped it clean. They scraped Jerusalem down to a nub, like nothing left. And that's why it's so hard to find evidence of the first and second temple, because there's nothing. You have to go way, way down to get down to foundations and things underneath all that. And they named it Ayatollah Capitolina, right? Yeah, they renamed it, right? And they renamed the area Palestine, essentially, which is where they continues to have its name here. So this was a catastrophic rebellion, and you could go visit the caves where they hid out. This is just south of Jerusalem, and this is Hannah going into it, and in Beit Guvrin. You can go down into these caves. There's Tori not being happy about being in a cave. And this is an aviary where they would keep the doves for food and eggs. And you just have to really climb through all these little things. It's pretty fascinating. You're going through the same caves and caverns and passages that these soldiers and families lived in the year 165. So, 1900 years ago. There's Janet. So between these three rebellions, 1/3 of the Jewish population was killed, okay, from 67 up through 135. So really, over about 200 years, about 1/3 of the Jewish population on Earth was killed. About the same percentage of population as the Holocaust. Hadrian's famous Hadrian's Wall, now he was done with these people, and you're not going to have Torah, you're not going to do anything, you're not going to be pretty much allowed to exist, but they were already scattered throughout the Roman Empire, right? So, but he would not let them, worship and practice the way that they wanted to. And over time, there we go. There was a constant Jewish presence up at Sfat, which is up in the Galilee, in Tiberias, up right on the Lake of Kinneret, right on the Lake Sea of Galilee, and a few families claim to have descent from Jerusalem. Like a handful of families claim constant presence in Jerusalem for thousands of years. But for all intents and purposes, there were virtually no Jews left in this land. They were all taken out in a diaspora, and they just kind of went to where the Romans were. And that's how we ended up in Europe, in England, in North Africa, and so on, right? So we were already out here in Mesopotamia. We were already there. That's the Babylonian exile. But that's how we ended up. That's what we call the diaspora, which is now complete at this point. So here we have all these different kind of Christian communities, and they're having disagreements. And so Constantine, when he comes to the throne, the emperor of Rome, he sees the cross, and he stayed pagan, by the way. He never did convert, or maybe right at the end of his life he did. His mother converted to Christianity. She bought it, all of it. But he did make Christianity the religion of the realm. Okay, so we're talking just about 130 or 40 years after that second rebellion. And he calls in the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea just settles some of these doctrine issues, that Jesus was the Son of God, which is equal to God, and the Holy Spirit. So the idea of the Trinity, the doctrine, the dogma was established here. The Nicene Creed comes from here. This is not where the New Testament canon was set, though. That occurred over the next, say, 30 years or so with different people. So when we look at the 27 books of the New Testament, that did not come fully into focus for another 20 or 30 years. Meanwhile, Jews were stuck in diaspora, and we complete the Talmud out there, okay, through all these kind of areas of scholarship in Babylonia, a little bit in Tiberias, and that's called the Jerusalem Talmud, but it was really in Tiberias. And during this time, when Jews were put upon, not allowed to enjoy their culture, their religion at all, there are passages in the Talmud that are not very charitable about non-Jews, to be honest with you. There really are. The Romans, they'll go on to decline. And so they're overtaken by the German tribes in the year 500 or so. And then we have the Byzantine Empire coming in after that. Now, because we were now spread out, there are now synagogues, and there have been a few kind of proto-synagogues before even the first rebellion against Rome. But now they really start to come into existence because Jews have to have their islands of community wherever they happen to be. So this is us visiting up in the north. This is about the year 500, this synagogue here in Bahram. And Kfar Ein Gedi, down on the Dead Sea, Kfar Nahum, which is Capernaum. So this is not the the synagogue that Jesus would have been in, because he did go to one, but it'd be underneath this. So the ruins of it would be underneath that. And then Beit Alpha, also in Judea. But they were all over now, the Mediterranean. Now we have the early church fathers, and so we get to some difficult passages. I just have to tell you, and I'm gonna stipulate for a second that just like I think most Christians, and I, again, don't want to speak for Christians everywhere for all time, but it just as they probably don't understand the context of Mark and Matthew, especially, and the gospel written in the aftermath of that first war and the destruction of the temple. That probably most Christians they may know these names, but I'm not sure they're aware of what I'm getting ready to show you. So I'm going to show you simply their writings. So their writings were preserved, their sermons were preserved, and I'm just going to I'm just the messenger here, okay? So Justin Martyr was about the year 145, and he had a dialogue with this Jew named Trypho, and Trypho, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. But the idea was that he was arguing with this Jew, and of course the Christian view prevails, right? So it was very condescending and very contemptuous of the Jewish viewpoint, and so he records it as if he won this argument. The Jew's very unspiritual, and he starts to really vilify Jews for killing Jesus, and you can just kind of see it. He was eventually sainted. So he's one of the earliest church fathers. I'm doing these in chronological order, Melito, was an advisor to Marcus Aurelius. This is all before Constantine. And he actually puts the term deicide. He's the one who actually says explicitly that Jews killed Jesus. Remember, though, he's talking to Marcus Aurelius. You think he's going to go to Marcus Aurelius and say, you Romans, you killed Jesus? That would be no bueno, I don't think, right? So, of course, but he really articulates it in a very direct way and a very constant way. And he starts talking about this new covenant that replaces the Jewish covenant. So the first kind of language about what we call supersessionism begins to occur. Marcion, a little bit later, and he was so supersessionalist that he wanted to expunge the Old Testament, the 5 books of Moses, from the Christian scripture. For that reason, he would not be sainted, and in fact, he was eventually excommunicated. Yeah. But those threads persisted, and some even persist today. Origen began, is Alexandria, so he was in Egypt, and he began to really, he was a Judeophile, like he had admiration for Jews, that they're still sticking around, I guess, a little bit. But he began to really do this idea that Christianity was replacing Judaism, that Judaism was an outdated, outmoded, ancient, irrelevant religion, basically, and people. He was never sainted either because he never held that he had the idea of the Trinity, right? Father, Son, Holy Ghost. But he had Jesus the Son subordinate to to God the Father. And that is not the modern Christian view. And because it was emerging at that time that Jesus was the same as the Son, was the same as the Father, that he was never sainted because of that. Because of the circumstances that Jews were finding themselves being put upon during this time, there were, I'm going to say that there were stories circulating that made a mockery of Jesus, circulating among Jews, or at least Origen said that Jews were circulating the stories. We don't really know. So obviously, even if this did not start with Jews, if you were Jewish and you were put upon by these people, you might buy into this thing that it's not real, right? So it's like putting your head in the sand a little bit. You might propagate this myth. But then if you're Christian and you hear about Jews propagating this myth, how does that go over? Not too well, I don't think. Not too well at all. Cyprian, Carthage, North Africa. And he was sainted too. So I'm going to show you this, and I'm not sure if you can read it. I'm going to read you just a few lines. But this is his writings, so let me just read some of these lines. The Jews have fallen under the heavy wrath of God because they have departed from the Lord and followed idols. And they did not believe in the prophets and put them to death. It was previously foretold that they would not neither know the Lord nor understand or receive him. That the Jews would not understand their holy scriptures. I may have lost my battery. That they would be intelligible at the last times after Christ had come, only after Christ had come. The Jews could not understand anything of Scripture unless they first believed in Christ. They would lose Jerusalem, they would lose light of the Lord, that the circumcision of the flesh was made void, or that Jesus was the ultimate sacrificial, Jesus was the circumcision, basically. New law to be given, blah, blah, blah. You just come to them. So this was Cyprian. Eusebius in Caesarea. So now we're back in Judea, right? At the city of Caesarea, about 330. So this is right about the time of Nicaea, and he was kind of Constantine's right-hand guy with this. And he was very, very direct that Jews have misunderstood their own scripture and they're heretics. And he wrote down he was kind of, oh my gosh, I don't know how to, the metaphor, but he wrote what Constantine decreed about anti-Jewish decrees. And he was eventually sainted. St. Jerome wrote the Vulgate, so keep in mind the Torah was in Hebrew, We had that. It had been translated into Greek, which was the Septuagint. Jerome went back to the Hebrew and translated it into Latin. That was his main, what most Christians know him for, called Vulgate. But he was not charitable to Jews at all, used this kind of language, carnal, lewd, materialistic, child of the world, and Chrysostom. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to flick through. So he wrote a series of sermons, and I'm going to give you the context of these sermons as you just kind of read some of the things he said, because the context is important. So he was in Constantinople, Turkey, and there was a sizable Jewish community there still. And there were these multiple other communities around, just the same kind of ones that Paul had kind of visited. So kind of these mixed communities. He could not fathom, he could not believe that Jews still existed. He couldn't further, especially not believe that anybody that knew about Jesus would want to do Yom Kippur, would want to get circumcised, would want to keep kosher. It just blew his mind. He could not understand it. And he wrote some of the following. The central threads are what you see here. These 8 homilies against the Jews. I'm just going to take a minute to let you read each slide. In this one, you can see where characterizing Jews as such starts to come. So at the end of the day, this is what has happened. Biblical Judaism. And we have the Pharisees writing down their oral tradition, the Mishnah and the Talmud, that Jesus writing down their oral tradition in the form of the Gospels, and essentially getting into the New Testament, Nicene Creed. And this is just kind of the timeline. Pharisees were Jesus, the Jesus sect was Pharisaic at first. Temple was destroyed right in here. And so these traditions are written contemporaneously at the same time by just two groups of people. Same thing with the Talmud and the New Testament being canonized in the Nicene Creed. And there we have modern rabbinic Judaism, what we observe today, what we understand today, and modern Christianity. So the thread of it is that despite Jesus being Pharisaic, he's depicted as being against the Pharisees / Jews. Therefore, it becomes the Gospels against the Jews of where they were living at the time. And then the church, when it had its institutions, and against the synagogue, the Jews. But eventually, the church was the Roman Empire and vice versa. So it was, I guess, it was going to prevail in that circumstance, culturally and historically. And when we have the church and it starts to do all these kinds of anti-Jewish decrees and things, you could just kind of get the sense of that Jews were characterized as this ancient, irrelevant people that had no right to exist. And in fact, the very fact that they exist and that all this happened to them is proof of the divinity and the righteousness of Jesus and our view of him. So the fact that all this befell us and that there were this diminutive people. So we look at it as we've been through a lot and we survive every time. Christians historically then and some now look at Jews as being small, the least among nations, which is language goes back to Torah, as proof that we are illegitimate. So these are some of the decrees. I'm not going to go over them. They're a matter of history, but they kind of carry forward. And this is the characterizations are to face, unfortunately, by some in the Christian community. I'm afraid to say maybe even most. While Jesus is compassionate and egalitarian, and he's open, forgiving, that Christianity is loving, and it's your path to eternal salvation. These are the characteristics of Jews and Judaism. And this continues through to modern day, right? So I'm not saying all Christians, of course not all Christians, but it's a common denominator among Christian theology that hopefully we're emerging out of, but it'll be a long slog to get there. And we have to each do our part. So we are and can be and have been viewed this way, using these kind of Old Testament and New Testament metaphors for who we are. And at the same time, Jews were, kind of writing back, slapping back a little bit, right? And so there's sections in the Talmud, I told you, that are very uncharitable towards non-Jews. I have to say that, I'll get to this second. And then there's this one called the Toledat Yeshua that is a full-scale polemic against Christianity. So it's out there. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
I had not until you start reading this stuff. And the reason you haven't heard of it is because it's rejected. It was rejected pretty much then, and it's pretty much rejected now. But it's out there. And so for the anti-Semite, it's right fertile ground to start plucking stuff out and to say, this is what Jews think about you. This is a tractate in the Talmud, and it talks about if you see this post, I hope you don't, but you will. You see it posted by an anti-Semite about it'll say the word the goy. Well, goy is a Yiddish word. That language didn't exist for 1,000 years. So that is already a mistranslation. But it starts to talk about Jewish attitudes towards Christians, and there are passages in there, for example, like it's okay to lie to a Christian, and it's okay to kill a Christian. But the reason it was written was because if you're a merchant on the way and a Christian were to come up to you and say, who are you? And are you Jewish? And you would say, no. Well, that's lying, but that's preserving your life and your well-being, maybe your wife even. Which is what Abraham did, by the way. He lied to protect his wife. So he said, it's my sister. And if you have to defend yourself, it's okay to kill the person that's attacking you. So that's that, no turning of the other cheek stuff. So it's put in those kinds of terms, but it's written for the context of its times. This is that Toledat Yeshua, and it's in Hebrew, and you can see it. It's just kind of, again, this parody about Jesus. It's probably for the Jews at the time, it was a little bit like Monty Python and the rabbit at the, whatever. It was a parody of Christians. I'm not saying it was nice to do or that it was a good idea to do, but it wasn't that they necessarily meant it as truth. It was just putting it out there. It was writings put out there. And of course, once Christians get at the time, and even now, modern anti-Semites, they see this stuff and they just go berserk because they think it's Jews writ large, kind of hold these kinds of things. And then we get to Martin Luther, and I'm going to give you this bit. I'm going to flick through some of the things that he wrote right after he nailed the thesis, actually towards the end of his life. And some people believe he had some dementia. Some people believe that his advisors talked him out of producing this booklet, but he produced it. And so I'll just flip through a few lines. This is 500 years ago. This is not ancient history, medieval. The other context is Martin Luther, when he did the Reformation. Remember, he was against the Catholic Church, right? He thought the Catholic Church had gotten corrupt, just like Jesus thought the temple had gotten corrupt, right? He figured, once I nailed these theses on, and once we reformed the Catholic Church, he didn't intend to start the Protestant faith. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church, just like Jesus wanted to reform the temple rights. He wanted to preserve it, but reform it. Well, it turned out to be a whole new way of observing Christianity. But he figured that as long as we throw off this kind of stuff about the church owning all this land and the money you have to give to them and all this kind of stuff, and get rid of all these vestments and the pomp, the circumstance, and all these gigantic cathedrals and stuff that your money's going to, that once we get rid of all that stuff, the Jews will come on board. And so that was his worldview. And then they didn't. And this is what he wrote. What?
Whoa,
Yeah, whoa.
we are banned. Whoa.
So the next one will probably resonate a little bit. What should we do with them? I'll give my sincere advice. First, burn the synagogues. Burn their homes. Burn their books. Don't travel, don't go anywhere, don't do business. So Hitler was by no means a religious person at all. In fact, he used pagan imagery, the swastika, the Roman eagle, all that is pagan stuff. But when he did the Nuremberg laws in Germany, Hitler was German, boy, did it resonate with the Christian community at the time because of Martin Luther. They were fine. Conversion doesn't matter, also Hitler. Forced labor. Okay. So I'm happy to say that the Lutheran Church and other Protestant denominations disavow this. Nevertheless, it's a matter of history, and if someone's going to pluck the total death Yeshua out and kind of point to something that was written that we reject, despite the fact that Protestant faiths have rejected this, that's still out there, and there are people that will still do it. Just like we know that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is forgery at the turn of the last century, forgery, Russian forgery. It's taken as an article of faith that is true, that there's a Jewish cabal. So I'll end with this. For us, I'm a firm believer that we Jews should confront the New Testament for sure. And I've got some books up here to do it. These two at the top are really excellent, kind of explaining Christianity in our terms and understanding our relationship with Christians. I think for anyone who knows me, we have difficult passages in our own scriptures. So are you aware that the attack that, and I've mentioned it, so maybe that's why you're aware of it. Otherwise, are you aware that the attack on Jericho, when Joshua came in, the trumpets and walls come tumbling down, that it says, kill them all. Kill them all. Don't let anything stand. That happened throughout the conquest of Canaan at the time. Basically ethnic cleansing. There are stories of forced conversion, right? So these are very difficult passages in our scripture. After the golden calf, you know what happened? God told Moses to do what? Tell the Levites to do what? Kill them all. Kill them all. Anyway, that's fratricide, killing other Jews. So these are very unpleasant, difficult passages. We should confront them, we should confront them. And the fact that they don't come up too much from the pulpit is a problem within us. The fact that this stuff doesn't occur and that Christians don't confront this tough stuff in their scripture is a problem. And they need to do it. We need to avoid at all costs, being a victim or conceiving ourselves as a victim. And I don't think we have. Even when we tell the story of the Holocaust, it's always as a matter of survival, another story of survival. We have to engage each other. This is the mission work, if you will, that Bill and I and others do with our trilogue, with Muslims too. And because, all this stuff is wired into us. It's in our DNA, unfortunately. And the only way to get rid of it or to change our DNA or the epigenetics or to take the genes that click on and off is to kind of have talks with people. Confront our own scripture. Other faiths need to confront their own scripture. And then we talk about these things. And that's how to kind of unwind it. So that's it. I think, I'm going to leave this slide up, but there is time for questions. So
Could you send out a reading list of those books you have?
sure. Maybe Janet can snap just a picture at the end of it and just kind of write down. That's probably the easiest thing to do. I mentioned, by the way, I didn't mention this particular book up here. This is The Rise and Fall of the Judean State. It's talking about, it's an older volume, but it's the kind of the sentinel book about the rise and fall of the Jewish revolt, the failed Jewish revolt, the first one, the big one. And it goes into the Bar Kokhba revolt a little bit too. It begs the question, it's kind of like the tone, like the rise and fall of the Third Reich, right? It's like still the sentinel volume. And it begs the question, because the Zealots at the time considered actualizing Judaism in the form of a nation state. In large part, because God said so, right? I'm going to give you this land. And Romans, you're sitting on it, and we're going to take it back. But that's what it meant to be Jewish, was to create a nation state on this soil. But then we have the diaspora and the brilliance of the Talmud writers. And so when did Judaism become what we understand it to be? Was it in the nation state, or was it in diaspora? I ask you to ask yourself that question. I think the brilliance of Judaism is in our presence throughout the world, where the scholarship took place, not necessarily in the form of a nation state. And we Jews need to confront that again today. Is this state of Israel doing what we think a righteous, democratic, Jewish, ethically bound, Torah-bound state should do? Question for food for thought. Seth.
I was going to say, it took a while for Martin Luther's ideas to take hold, and a lot of which put up there is not original thinking to him. It took about 1,000 years in Western Europe for that to start.
Correct.
But in the early days of Jewish settlement in Western Europe, Jews and Christians got along.
Yeah.
In fact, in early modern Europe, you don't have these big nation states. There's still a lot of small kingdoms, and you find instances of small kings allowing Jews to live and giving them protection,
Yep.
even some of the popes.
Yep.
But what begins to happen is both sides, Christians and Jews, are arguing about chosenness. So we've just read parts in Exodus now where God is saying, you're my people, and the Jews are saying, see, we're right, and Christians are going, no, we're right. Now, Paul introduces something he didn't mention, what some authors call the inverted binary. So Paul looks at Esau and Isaac,
Yep.
and where the older brother has to bow down to the younger brother.
Right.
So Paul is saying,
Yeah.
we're the younger brother, so Jews are going to be subservient. He doesn't say get rid of Jews.
Right.
He's hoping they'll convert.
Right.
So this conflict is taking a long time.
That's correct.
It's fights over usury takes a while. Christians don't want to lend money. They're not supposed to. They're not supposed to put money out in interest. But on the other hand, Christians need, rulers and people need to borrow money.
Right.
So Jews are a lot of the small-time pawnbrokers.
Right.
So Jews and Christians are doing business.
Okay.
You find instances of Christian clerics pawning their vestments
Right.
and other objects, and the Jews are doing business.
Right.
So they're getting along.
Right, so the Dark Ages were dark in part because of the ban on usury, on lending.
Yes.
All right, so that commerce came to a grinding halt until the Jews got involved in certain areas.
And as European civilization changes, as you get bigger cities, Christians and Jews now are living in close contact, but sometimes in conflict and sometimes not.
Okay.
What is, from our point of view, what is baptism? I'm talking about John called the Baptist because he baptized Jesus. What is that?
Well, and insofar, and I'm no expert, of course, but insofar as I understand it, it's derived from the mikvah. So he put people into the water that had it, mikvah has to be natural, free, water. And so it was the Jordan River in that case. But Jesus supposedly did it in the Sea of Galilee. So it's the baptism is renewal, and it took on a different meaning. But women have to do the mikvah after their period, right? You have to renew kind of physically and spiritually. And you convert, you do the mikvah, and so you're renewing. So it's really just derived from the mikvah. Yep.
Just to your point, it just takes one person to pick up a writing that was written hundreds or thousands of years ago, interpret it in their own way, and then it becomes something which it was never intended.
Yeah, I think that it's not just a matter of interpreting it a certain way. I think it's a matter of cherry picking. Like you pick out this one, and that informs a worldview, or two or three. So you get confirmation bias, right?
Transmitting it.
So you begin, and you take all the affirming stuff, and it reinforces your view, but you kind of disregard the non-confirming stuff because it doesn't confirm, right? So that's a very uncomfortable thing, to have two things in your head, one that confirms, one that doesn't, so you just reject that.
Well, we have so much access now, especially with social media.
Yeah.
We can read and see all these things, but yet we're so isolated.
Oh, yeah, but the algorithm picks up your confirmation bice. It goes to what you've already looked at.
Talk about social media.
Yeah.
Those are the original YouTubers and
Yeah,
TikTokers.
true that. These pamphlets that would circulate around.
That's what it is.
I think years ago, I'm talking about the Merchant of Venice, and that the Jews were given the money task because it was untastefully for Christians to handle money at that time period. So they were giving the task of the money handling to Jewish people.
That's correct. That's what we were talking about. Charlie?
Are there any writings of the church fathers that were actually friendly toward the Jews, or were they uniformly this way?
That's a good question. So I got into confirmation bias by showing you all the negative stuff. Of course, there were historically, and throughout the times I showed you, just on a couple slides, these anti-Jewish edicts. But there were edicts that were supporting Jewish civil rights, basically, at the same time. It does riff off of what Seth was saying, that these dukes and, they would bring in Jews for commerce purposes, merchants and people, not just for lending, but merchants to do trade, because they were spread out among the area, but they were typically outside the feudal system. So they were given protection from the king in the way the serfs were not. And so it would go okay for a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, and then the serfs would begin to really resent it, and the duke's great-grandson doesn't like it, the whole thing anymore, and then they would be kicked out again. And it would repeat over and over again.
Yeah.
Well, a lot like that. Yeah.
There
Over and over again.
are writings of the popes and other church fathers trying to cut down on violence.
There are.
Because we think of knights nowadays as these good guys like the Lone Ranger who are going around rescuing damsels and slaying dragons. In fact, they were fighting people, and what they did was fight. They fight with each other. The church was trying to say, well, we'll only have wars on certain days of the week. You can fight on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Don't fight on the Sabbath. But actually, to cut down on violence in Europe and also against the Jews. So Charlie, yeah, you do find instances of that.
All right, well, we're right at noon, so I want to thank all for coming and hope you enjoy the rest of your pretty Sunday now. And I'll stick around for any questions. And thank you very much. I'm going to check with you for a second.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're in Greensboro now, but we all went to schools. I live in Greensboro. Yeah, I'm on your email list, so. Yeah. So I got on everybody's email list. I get emails all the time. Yeah.
Sorry to talk.
No, I mean, they've got religious studies here.
I would love to bring so many people over here.